This is the second of our lectures, our mini lectures on the topic of perversion. We're going to pick up from where we left off before. We'd made a couple of assertions that are particularly useful in Freudian psychoanalysis before we go on to turn to how Lacan will talk about perversion in Seminar 1. One of the points we made before is that perversion, in a sense, or let's be more precise, not perversion, but polymorphous sexuality, is, in a sense, the ground zero of sexuality per se. Now, if that's the case, then if polymorphous perversity is something akin to an undifferentiated state of drive, then this is the natural or original state of sexuality as such. So just to reiterate that point, we could also say that in an odd kind of way, the vast majority of human sexuality is perverse insofar as it occurs beyond the remit of human reproduction, and insofar as it finds expressive form in any number of varying objects and practices. And of course, in making that assertion, I'm just making reference back to this idea that Freud gives us, that we could start to think about perversion in terms of deviations from, as it were, heterosexual procreative sexuality. Tim Dean has a nice kind of one-liner that he offers in this respect. He points out that if we end up thinking of perversion as a fixation on only a narrow subvariety of sexual acts and forms of gratification, then we end up with the conclusion that heterosexual genital intercourse itself should be considered a perversion, which is a kind of nice demonstration that in times when we try to do these descriptions, these definitions that separate categorically perversion from normal sexuality, we start to find these aporia. We start to find these ways in which that fundamental categorical distinction doesn't always work. So just before we turn to Lacan and Seminar 1, I wanted to return briefly to an idea that was pretty crucial in the first of the mini lectures, and that is the idea that a neurosis can be seen as the negative of a perversion. And I just wanted to give a kind of concrete example of this, which seems to justify that notion. The example comes from a piece of work I did a long time ago when I was doing an internship, and it was within in a prison context, and it was with sexual offenders. And in that type of work, at least in my experience of that type of work, it was very often the case that offenders weren't particularly, they might want to speak to someone, but they're not always particularly keen about talking about their offense. And as part of a kind of forensic group, we were, frequently told, well, you're here to do forensic types of psychotherapy, so you kind of do need to ask about the offense. That's an important part. So I was used to doing that and then being a little bit stonewalled and not getting much and not getting very far. So one day I arrive at someone's cell and I said, you asked to see someone, here I am. We sat down and I, said, maybe you could tell me a little bit about how you got here. And then, the person I was speaking to started to outline in a lot of detail a whole itinerary of sexual offenses that he had committed, in a lot more detail than perhaps was necessary at that time and in that situation. I was a little bit dumbstruck by this and listened, but in retrospect, it may have been kind of a good idea to interrupt that exposition, just because it seemed that there was the possibility of, in recounting in so much detail all of these events, that the person themselves was getting a certain amount of enjoyment, and perhaps a certain amount of enjoyment also in me being affected by a whole lot of gratuitous details that you would say aren't often shared, and presumably something that would normally cause someone a little bit shameful or embarrassed. And I suppose that's my point. In this experience, when I went away from it and reflected upon it, it just seemed to me that the way this person had described this material to me, there was absolutely none of a kind of neurotic self-consciousness that would stem from an attempt to create a likable image of oneself. None of the neurotic self-consciousness that would be attached to a kind of self-exculpating narrative, I didn't do it, or if I did that, it wasn't really me, it was part of my past that's beyond me. This was just not the case here. There was no attempt to present himself as somehow likable before an unknown interlocutor, in other words, before me, just a straightforward cataloging of events. Now, we're often told in the Lacanian field that if it is the case that the perverse subject is the object cause of the other's enjoyment, then one indication that you might be working with someone who's a little bit perverse is if there's a systematic pattern whereby you are fundamentally made anxious by the revelations, by the speech, by the actions of one's analysand or patient, then maybe you're in the domain of perversity. Now, immediately, there's an important caveat here, because we're also told in the Lacanian field that countertransference reactions are not the basis of interpretations. Countertransference is more about you than what you might use it to do in order to make an interpretation about someone else. Basic Lacanian 101 clinical idea. That being said, I suppose there is nevertheless an important situation, as in the one I just described. It is important to be aware of if there is something systematic happening about this, about the fact that you are fundamentally, in quite an acute way actually, made to feel a certain degree of sexual anxiety that is occurring again and again, and that seems to involve something of perhaps a gratuitous sharing or too much sexual detail, or sexual detail of a kind of disturbing sort. Maybe that's just obvious, but just to reiterate that point. Back, though, to the situation that I just described, we could ask then, was what this, my therapist's colleague, whatever, my patient, so to speak, was this part of his agenda? To be honest, I don't know if there was an attempt to provoke some kind of anxiety or negativity or intensity in me. There could have been, but my conclusion was that that may have been part of it, but in another way, there was also a sense in which any potential interlocutor was irrelevant. His own relationship to his jouissance was neither shameful nor in any way problematic, not something to be embarrassed about, not something to hide. No interlocutor was likely to introduce any kind of guilt or shame. And so I use that example just to illustrate that the absence of repression, of sexual repression, the absence of any kind of attempt to distance oneself from those acts, that seemed to be a strong case of how neurosis is the negative of a perversion. This was, as it were, as an orientation towards certain sexual acts, which was fundamentally not neurotic. So it was kind of a powerful learning experience for me, and seems to exemplify that Freudian notion. Let's also then add a further clinical note here. Maybe what's important is not so much the nature of the acts that are shared with one in analysis, but you could say, well, how quickly is someone willing to share certain ostensibly transgressive or deviant kinds of sexuality, and in what way are they willing to share it? So it's not so much the nature of the thing that is conveyed, but how it's conveyed, how rapidly it's conveyed, and if it's conveyed in a way which also is aiming to try engender some kind of response in the person listening to them. So that's a little introductory preface. Let's now look at how Lacan's going to speak about perversion in Seminar 1. And if we go to page 221 in Seminar 1, we will see Lacan remarking on perversion as follows. What is perversion? It is not simply an aberration in relation to sexual criteria. It is not simply an anomaly contrary to good morals, although this register is not absent, nor is it an atypicality according to natural criteria, namely that it derogates from the reproductive finality of the sexual union. It is something else in its very structure. Now, interestingly, he uses the word structure there, and of course we've had a little moment where we've wondered about whether perversion is structural, and of course you could say that when he talks about it in its very structure, it doesn't necessarily mean, it means it's got a structure of sorts, doesn't necessarily mean it's structural as a structural diagnostic, subjective structure, but just want to throw that out there. But back to that brief description. What is perversion? It's not simply an aberration in relation to sexual criteria. Okay, so we don't simply designate or locate or find perversion simply in relationship to sexual criteria. I'll say a little more of that. It is not an anomaly contrary to good morals. Okay, again, that I think we've got to by now. We don't think about perverse enactment simply in relationship to morality. This is psychoanalysis after all. It's not about that. Although this register is not absent, he says. So that's a kind of crucial and interesting qualification. It's not fundamentally about morals, but it's not, and it's not simply about sexual criteria, but those things may not be absent. So what does that mean? Well, one way of taking that up is if to be perverse, or if a perverse enactment is there precisely to engender, to generate some jouissance anxiety in the other. What would be a better way to do that than doing something within the field of sexuality, which is a privileged domain of repression, of taboo? What would be a better way of creating anxiety and jouissance in another than to do something or to speak of or enact something of sexuality that goes beyond the societal norms and boundaries for which that is normally appropriate or which is no longer appropriate? So it's not fundamentally, here's an interesting way of putting it then, perversion is not even fundamentally about sexuality in this approach, and it's certainly not fundamentally about morals and about norms of reproductive sexuality. I know that sounds like a big contradiction. Although we would expect to find that perverse enactments would often occur in relationship to sexuality, in relationship to moral norms, precisely because if perversion is exactly the attempt to engender anxiety and jouissance in others, what could be a better place to do it than in those forms of transgression? So that's a crucial thing to bear in mind and a useful way of reading Lacan's point there. He goes on to say, namely, it derogates, well, he's saying it in a negative sense. It's not to be considered perversion simply because it derogates from the reproductive finality of the sexual union. And I think that point we have stressed. I just want to linger a little bit over this idea then that sexuality is not necessarily, although typically, often, very frequently is presented in perversion. Let's give two examples of how that may be the case. In other words, two examples of how sexuality may not be fundamentally evident in a case of a perversion. The first will be from Alenka Zupanchik's description of disavowal and perversity. And she gives an example that's also discussed by Zizek, I guess, and that is from Sophie's Choice. So Sophie's Choice is both a novel and a film with Meryl Streep in. And we have a Jewish mother with two children who's escaping the Nazis. And she's apprehended, and one of the Nazis, I guess, who is apprehending and questioning her, gives her this kind of ultimatum. You may take one child and escape, but the one child will not. And for Alenka Zupanchik, this is the absolute sort of ground level crystallization of the perverse enactment. And of course, you could say, well, sexuality isn't, certainly not in an obvious sense, involved here. In what way is this perverse? Well, it's perverse in as much as it will engender a huge and even, you could say, unending form of anxiety and negativity, intensity of jouissance in the other. It will engender that maybe for as long as that person lives, because they are now forced to make a decision where they nominate which of their children will go to the death camps. So we find another example of this in Slavoj Žižek's work, where he gives the example of a political assassination. It happens in the Netherlands, if I remember correctly. There's a journalist who is killed with a knife stabbed. There's a note on it, which is a warning to another journalist. Should you continue to say certain problematic things about my religion, you will follow. And I'm doing this and this is also very important for Zizek, we have an act then, a murderous act, which sends a message to another. And because it's done within the public realm and it's going to be reported in the news, it sends a message to a huge number of people, to the big other, you could say. And that is, if you do this again, this will happen. And I am doing it. This is what the point that Zizek emphasizes. This is in his little book, How to Read Lacan. I am doing it because I am the instantiation of this religious cause. It's not simply me. I am the object instrument, to go back to that definition, that little maxim of Lacan's before. I am the object instrument of the other's jouissance. And here already we start to get we start to get the double valence of the other's jouissance. I am going to cause you a great deal of terror, you, the journalist who I've written a note to that is pinned to the dead body of someone I've killed, which is a warning. I'm going to create a huge amount of intensity of affect, a huge amount of negativity, a huge amount of fear and anxiety. But I'm also doing so in a way which sends a message to a much broader community. And we'll speak a little bit about that, but this signifies for us the centrality of the role of the other, the big other, in any perverse enactment. So that's a crucial point, but also just to make the point here that this is a mode that is perverse in a very fundamental way without necessarily involving sexuality at all. Certainly not obviously, although of course how you define jouissance will have some impact on that. And just to go back to the Aleko Zupančić example, in that moment where the Nazi says to Sophie, you have to choose, it's again a situation where they are an object instrument of an other's jouissance, I suppose you could say, of the Führer's. Like there is a sense that I am the instrument of another cause, of something more fundamental than me. I am merely the instrument that is doing that, but it's not just that other, the big other, that is being given some, let's say, horrific, gratifying jouissance of terrorizing someone. But it's also, of course, Sophie herself is condemned to, you could say, a lifelong suffering caused by being forced to act in a certain way. So just to reiterate the idea that a diagnosis of perversion does not, in fact, rely on the presence of apparent sexual transgressions, which then means, crucial point, that in what notion of perversion in Lacanian terms may apply also to what in other diagnostic categories we would think about antisocial personality disorder. Not always, one would have to think carefully about it, but simply to make the point that it's not always about sexuality in the most obvious of senses. We've noted the importance of the law, we've noted the importance of the big other, we've noted the importance of how we might understand jouissance in this kind of aphoristic diagnostic statement is of the perverse subject is the object cause of the other jouissance. That seems a good place to stop. What we'll do in the follow-up lecture is to think a little bit about the role of what we could call the perverse couple. And we'll be making reference to Jean Claverel's paper, The Perverse Couple, to do just that.